Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Technology doesn't always play ball. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, and thank you to you all. Thank you to the Research Office, Mareke and her colleagues, for organizing this event this afternoon. The PowerPoint was mainly images I wanted to share with you from books. The first is already mentioned in the abstract that I circulated in the invitation that you received, and other images from a book that I published, co-authored with colleagues of mine. But I will talk about those images verbally. What I want to do this afternoon, I wanted to start with this image on this book, which is a book by Monica Wilson, a very well-known anthropologist at UCT in the 1960s, and Archie Mafeje, who was also another well-known professor of anthropology. They published the book in 1963. I start with the book because often issues of ethical concerns or ethical codes and ethical principles and values in research are often talked about as if they exist as separate from the actual people doing the research. They are guidelines, they are there, we memorize them, we study them, we use them to evaluate research proposals, but we don't often link them to what it means. What do these ethics mean? What do we mean by reflexivity? When we say someone must be reflective, there's a guideline. They're all sort of points to be noted, but very rarely is it linked to actual experience. Well, it is linked to the research, but I think examples, critical incidents, so to speak, that highlight what these ethics mean are important, and which is why I started with this book. The book has a picture. It's by Monica Wilson and Archie Mafeje, as I state in the abstract. I found this book at the library when I was preparing for my professorial inaugural lecture at UCT. It was left on the desk in the library of the UCT library by someone obviously working on the book. Outside the book, the outside cover is a jacket cover, is a picture of my father. I did not know this. I never knew. I was quite surprised in the library. It's quite an old cover, tattered around the edges, and it's a colored image with purples and white and black, and there on the cover is a picture of my father. I sent my mother a copy of the book. Well, first of all, I paged inside to see what is the book about. I knew, of course, about Monica Wilson's publications, but I was curious to see, is there another picture of my father inside the book? And I saw another picture of my father in the book, but his name is not in it. So I sent my mother a copy of the book, which she had never seen. She'd never seen this book or heard of it, although she remembered very clearly the visits by Professor Monica Wilson and Archie Mafeje and their anthropology students to our home on number 69 Brinton Street in Langa, who were conducting their research, as my mother says, to, quote, understand the traditions and beliefs of people who lived in Langa, unquote. Despite my father's photo being on the cover and inside, his name is not acknowledged in name inside the book. And so when I sent the book to my mother to see it, she wanted to hold the book to see for herself what I was telling her about it. She then sent it back to me, and I had an image to show you what she did when she received the book. So on opening the book, she realizes my father's name is not in it, and then she writes it by hand, Mr. W.T. Gobodo. I was deeply moved by my mother's act of naming my father in a UCT library book, Mr. W.T. Gobodo. It seemed to me that by writing my father's name in her own handwriting, even on this one copy of the book, my mother was restoring my father's dignity. Mr. W.T. Gobodo. I could not help but wonder what the absence of my father's name had evoked for my mother, what past memories this act of exclusion of his name brought back for her. It struck me that the simple act of writing my father's name was something more, perhaps an inscription, a demand for recognition, inserting her imprint and his name in the space that was silent about my father's identity, Mr. W.T. Gobodo. In a phone conversation with her, she said her recollection of the research by Wilson and Mafeje and their students was to learn about the traditions and beliefs of black people in Langa. I asked her what she thought my father would have responded to this issue of the photo without acknowledgement of his name. He would have felt ashamed, she said. She explained that as a proud man, these are her words, as a proud man, a loaded term, the nuances of which I hope I have time to explain later. And she said he would have felt humiliated, misled into contributing to something that was not what it seemed. My mother's reference to what she thought would have been my father's feeling of humiliation in response to the absence of his name reminded me of my own sense of humiliation and shame when, as a clinical psychology master's student at Rhodes University, we were given an assignment in cognitive behavioral psychology, which involved discussion of a study by black mine workers. I spent my later childhood in the former Transkei, growing up with boys who, as older teenagers or young adults, later went on to work in the mines. The stories of humiliation, of being stripped every day naked, returned when reading about themes of mental inferiority and such kinds of themes that are associated with blackness in this study about black mine workers. Being the only black student in a class of 6, the other 5 all white, my reaction in class led to our director, Peter Parker, to arrange a group process for our class, which was led by a group psychologist, Roger Brooke, who then ran a few weeks of a group discussion as a way of dealing with the issues that emerged after my reaction to the study in class. I open my presentation with these stories to show how research, the doing of it and the reading about it, can often be a site of trauma and humiliation. I wish to argue this afternoon that while this is a familial and personal stories, these stories are familial and personal stories, these issues are of critical significance in our current political time and are relevant for many people with whom I share a historical background. The personal is political. This argument of the personal being political is not new, and yet demands of researcher objectivity continue to lurk behind decisions by ethics committees. A researcher, for instance, should not be too close to their subject matter because such closeness might taint the study. Our subjectivity, we know now, is defined by history. We should pay attention to this issue, and we should make sure that as we think about issues of ethics, particularly of reflexivity, we need to rethink what we mean by these concepts. My own understanding of these meanings stems from a psychological understanding of reflexivity, which has to do with intersubjectivity. We encounter the world bringing our own histories, what people call baggage. We bring our own histories, and these histories often are embedded in our deep unconscious, sometimes deep in our skin. These issues, as we encounter others that we want to research, we are bringing our histories that we carry in our body. If those histories are associated with trauma, we're bringing the trauma that we carry in our bodies. Trauma is embodied in the body. But most importantly, particularly in our context, in our political context, and in the aftermath of the story that the Vice-Chancellor has explained as related, we ought to pay attention to these subtle issues that we may not always be aware of. When I speak about intersubjectivity, I'm talking about the encounter between two worlds, two people, different groups of people who bring their identities. Given our history of separation, coming from different worlds, having been forced into separation, discriminated, dehumanized, and all of these things that are associated with difference. When groups of people encounter research, such as in our context, we are bringing our blackness, we are bringing our whiteness with all of that these stories carry. The main point that I want to make today is that often these are deeply in the unconscious. And so the idea of intersubjective reflexivity requires that we understand what the dynamics of these histories are, how they play out in our unconscious, and how they influence our research. Now, we know when we speak about reflexivity, we are talking about what the researcher brings into the research, what they bring into their analysis, and how the research affects them. Now, that is all good, well and good, but what does it actually mean? What it means for me is that these multiple layers of identity, the fact that one is black with a history that we bring coming from this country, suggests that the moment we approach research, we are going to be using the lens of the scholarship, the epistemological knowledge, plus the lens of who we are as black or as white people. Having worked with students here at this university and other universities, black students and white students, I have observed the following. When it comes to these complicated histories of details of our history, such as race and trauma, I find that students respond in very interesting ways. Such as, for example, students try to either avoid confronting their own histories, or because of the anonymity of the issues that are before them, they respond in very violent ways. A student, for example, doing research on race and microaggressions at Stellenbosch, her starting point in doing this research is that of anger. Why is she angry? Now we have to engage the student around this issue of anger. Students are not thinking about why they are angry. They are just being angry. We've got to understand that this is an aspect of reflexivity that is critical. Why are you angry? I'm angry because Stellenbosch is racist. Now, we've got to understand that this is a statement that doesn't mean much in the context of research. You've got to sit to the student and say, what do you mean Stellenbosch is racist? The student is doing research. They are trying to understand microaggressions. They've interviewed students, most of whom confirm their experiences of microaggression. But as a scholar, they have to reflect differently. But the reason they are angry is because they themselves have experienced the same encounters of microaggressions at the university, in the town, and elsewhere. So they're bringing all of that into the study. So intersubjectivity here suggests that this is not just about you bring what you come with what you bring and the research influences you. It means you've got to think deeply about what does this mean exactly, so that in supervision, as the people supervising such studies, we must understand that some of this stuff lies at a very subtle, it occurs at a very subtle level, influences the research at a very subtle level. And in order to build the skill of the student, they have to understand how this history, this racialized history, is affecting her work to the extent that she is using that lens, the lens of the history, rather than the lens of thinking about research. Now, the importance of this is that her lens is critically important, because then her positionality, the standpoint of being a racialized other, informs her powerfully in terms of how to understand the pain of the students that she is studying. If you come from the experience of having been abused, been humiliated, dehumanized, this lens is an added advantage for you, because you are reflecting from the experience of a subject rather than an object. You know exactly what it means. Therefore, the supervision, rather than rejecting the student's work and say, this is not good enough, the student ought to understand the importance of their experience, that your experience informs how you think about the research, so that your analysis brings into play the feelings of these students. Rather than an objectively analyzed project, you put yourself in it and use your experience to understand what is going on in the world of the student. I think the importance of this point is that if our research is relevant, if we argue that we're doing socially conscious research, then you ought to think about the question of social justice. A research that is bringing into the knowledge ideas around what it means to be socially conscious about issues of justice can enrich not only our knowledge, but can also enrich our relationships, because then now we understand what's going on. Rather than reject this research as racially based research, we embrace it. We understand it at its core, that it is about enlightening us about what is going on. I give you now an example of a student who is white doing research that also affects them. One of my students, when I was at Free State University, was doing a PhD on conscription. The brief for this student was that we want to understand the intergenerational issues in families where fathers participated in conscription. The student was very enthusiastic, very excited about this research, and went out to conduct the work to collect the data. The first interviews, the pilot study that he did, he was very excited. He found two students whose fathers were in the army, in the South African Defence Force in Mozambique and in Angola, and was talking about the experiences of the father as an angry father who never talks about his experiences but acts out his anger. We were all very excited, my student and I, about this, that there is data that is emerging. But when he had to continue with the study, the student could not continue. He abandoned the PhD, and his explanation was that this is too much for me. It's too much for him. Why is it too much for him? It affects him personally. He is deeply implicated. And so I've got 4 points that I want to make about this issue of reflexivity here, that in addition to these notions of bringing something about who we are and being influenced by the research, when thinking about intersubjective issues around reflexivity, we've got to ask the question, how am I implicated in this research? As a first question. How am I implicated? Go out into the world to conduct a study. How am I implicated in this research or in these issues that I am doing research on? Secondly, what are the consequences of my research for the research participants? Thirdly, does my research promote the dignity of the participants? To do no harm. And fourthly, but to ask this question in a way that is grounded in today's politics, which is to say a consciousness about social justice. Does the research contribute to promotion of dignity of the people I'm working with? And then finally, what is my role as witness? And I consider this last point a very important one in terms of doing research that is socially conscious. What is my role as witness? What is my responsibility? That is to say, having done this research, what am I going to do about it? I publish, I write my PhD thesis, I write the articles in the journals. I've witnessed something. I've gone out there and I've witnessed something. I've witnessed the suffering, I've witnessed the trauma, I've witnessed the continuities from the past in this study. What is my responsibility? It's a question that if our university is a university that upholds certain values and has a certain moral framework for us, has built this moral framework around the values of the university, if these are our values, we ought therefore to be conscious of what our research does. What is my responsibility? This is a question that we asked ourselves recently on Sunday when we launched a book that we have recently published based on research done in Langa, Bonteheuvel, and Worcester. But before I go to that, I want to share with you what happens when you're doing research as a group. What happens when you're gathered with others from different backgrounds, keeping in mind all of these issues that I have raised around issues of our identity and our subjectivity and how we're positioned in relation to research. I observed these dynamics, these complicated dynamics, when in 2008 we were doing research. We're not doing research, actually. I subsequently did research, but we're responding to the xenophobic violence in 2008. I was at UCT at the time, in May 2008, and I, with Astrid Berg, a psychiatrist at UCT, we co-organized a group of professionals as a team that was responding to the crisis of the xenophobic violence at the time. I cannot forget an encounter during that time with some of my colleagues. We sent out an invitation to the colleagues from psychology organizations around Cape Town. So they came, they were in private practice. Some of them were social workers at UCT, thank you very much. Is there a glass? Perhaps, thank you. And other universities around Cape Town. And they came together, we came together from different racial backgrounds. One of the moments that I cannot forget is very interesting and speaks to the issue of what we bring to this conversation is a moment when we were running a group with a colleague, and with three colleagues, and two of them were white, and I was the only black, and we were running the group at Chrysalis. Is it called Chrysalis? Is that center called Chrysalis? And the colleague started introduce everyone and introduce herself, and then she went on to address the people and said the members of the group from Rwanda, from Zimbabwe, from the Congo. Thank you so much. And she says, I am so ashamed of what my fellow South Africans have done. And I want you to know, I'm trying to find this, I want you to know that even us, and she emphasized, even us, we feel isolated, although this is our own country. We feel excluded now, although this is also our country. And it was very interesting to me hearing her speak. Here we are, three of us, we are coming to help contain what was going on as colleagues. And already she is dividing us in terms of an us and them. And what was fascinating for me thinking about this later is the question, what moved her into making this statement at that point in time? And it seems to me, and again, this is conjecture, but it seems to me that in the context of what is going on with the xenophobic violence, my colleague, as a white colleague, had to separate herself from these others who were responsible for the violence, firstly. And secondly, as a white person, it seemed to me that something about the shame of her own history as a white South African at the time might have evoked that statement, that now she is sitting in the midst of an event, a violent event in a country from which she benefited, and the finger now points at those black people out there who were oppressed in the past, and now she's sitting on this other side as the good South African, the good white South African. There was a collision of these histories at that particular moment. And I think it's important for us to think about all of these dynamics when people are conducting research, because then when we think about how we train people, these are some of the things we have to put in the center of our research, that these are critical to help us understand what is going on here. Often when we are confronted with research, the debates about ethics and reflexivity tend to be at a superficial level. But given our crisis at this time in South Africa, even the response to the research by these young people, the response is very well is justified. The response is justified. But there's something that we're not talking about as far as this research is concerned. We're not talking about the question of the reality that black people, people of color in South Africa, are inclined to suffer from certain lack of capacity of knowledge, capacity of skill. They tend to be exposed, to be vulnerable to suffering from these consequences precisely because they have been excluded. They have been undermined, they've been marginalized, they have not been exposed to this experience, and repeatedly over history and over generations, the exposure to the suffering and the traumas predispose people to certain way of being in the world. We know, for instance, in our work in trauma, that repeated experiences of trauma does tend to affect people to the extent that they do not have a sense of knowledge of certain things that are expected from, say, an adult who has had education. People who have been excluded from education opportunities, who have not been exposed to certain kinds of skills, who have been traumatized, humiliated, dehumanized. There's a certain way in which they are positioned in the world. It takes away a level of agency and autonomy. And when you lack autonomy and agency in the world, there's certain capacities that are taken away from you. And that discussion, we have not had that discussion. We've reacted to this piece. We have not looked into the question of what are the consequences of years and years and years of marginalization, of oppression, of dehumanization. What are the consequences of this kind of life on people who are part of our South African community? We have not looked into that. And yet, if this research were to pronounce on that issue, if it were to set aside the fact that the people who are being studied do not have the capacity to engage in these kinds of tests and experiments that they were conducting, they were not able to perform to a certain level. Set aside that, the question that remains is, why is that happening? And that, to me, is the issue that our research ought to address. Now, back to the research, the recent research that we have conducted. As I mentioned earlier, my work has been influenced by who I am, my background, my history in terms of research and as a person. And I've been very fortunate in working with colleagues coming from all racial groups who are committed to doing this kind of research that interests me. But our commitment understands very clearly that to conduct research and to present the finding is not sufficient. You've got to do something more. So what is the more that we have done? The more that we have done was the following. We have collected data from Langa, Cape Town, and Langa, Bonteheuvel, and Worcester, and we are beginning to analyze this work. My colleagues are here with whom I'm working, Kim Whale and Mariki Olufsen. Friederike Bubenza at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation is not here, but these are the people I work with. Our approach to this research was, first, we want to understand what are the continuities of trauma from the past into the present. What is the evidence that there are continuities? And what is the evidence that we are dealing not just with the continuities from the past, the transgenerational issues, but also with the current issues. And what are the current issues? And we have found overwhelmingly a sense of humiliation. Currently, a sense of humiliation, a sense of lack of meaning, and these people waking up in this wide void, yawning void of emptiness every day of their lives. In other words, the everydayness of a much different trauma, an insidious kind of trauma, an everyday kind of trauma today. How do we understand then the interplay between the past and the present? Now, we are approaching this research, and we have got all these terms of we have to be reflexive, we've got to understand what is going on, and we had huge debates with our team. What does it mean for us as differently positioned, as white scholars and black scholars? We had a team of about 10 researchers. What does it mean as differently positioned scholars to be doing this kind of research, and what do we want to do? What's the message? Besides that epistemological issues, where are we taking it? In other words, how do we do research in a way that transcends our research itself? And so we came up with the idea that we need to present this work back to the community, first of all. Now, we all know this. Qualitative research especially, it is repeated in all of the guidelines. You must do research, take it to the community for validation and all of this. But do we ever do it? Often not. Or if we ever do, people will just take the thesis and send it to the agency that helped them with the analysis. We thought through this process and we realized that our more has to be a real sense of empowering people, giving them back their stories in ways that they will embrace. We found an organization that funded the translation of the stories that we were going to publish in a book. We selected a few stories that were representative from Langa, from Bonteheuvel, from Worcester. We then decided that we are publishing these stories. I'm just sorry that I didn't bring the book to show you. I had a picture in the slide. We decided to publish this book in 3 languages, in Xhosa, English, and Afrikaans. The stories, the excerpts of the stories are in all 3 languages. Additionally, we decided, okay, these are stories that tell about the trauma of these people, that these people have suffered. These are traumatic stories. You read them, you see the trauma. These are stories mainly of the adult generation. We interviewed both adults and young people. The adult generation are talking about what happened during apartheid and how it continues to affect them. Just 2 stories and examples. One man in the book talks about how his home, he says it was like an estate home. It was a big house with a big long passage and a big yard. And now they lost that home and they were sent to Bonteheuvel. And now he is facing a life where he has to protect his children from all the violence around them. And he sees his house being on sale over all the years that the house is being on sale. His home, his original home, he has no say in that home. A woman who talks about how she was riding a train going to the colored beach, and in the train, sitting on the colored side of the train, carrying the ball, excited about spending the day on the beach. The ball rolls over to the white side. And the police guard on the train is so angry, he starts beating up her father. The father is all bloodied by the time they get to the next station, and it's the end of the beach day. They end up at the police station because the father has to go and explain why this ball rolled over to the white side, because now the daughter wants the ball back. Those kinds of stories, and this is an old woman, she then, and this is a story that is, you read it, it's moving. But then, because you can see the image of the woman in photograph, because we then say, we worked with 2 young black photographers, budding photographers, to take pictures of all the people whose stories are in the book, so that we represent them in all their dignity, that while you read the story of trauma, it doesn't take away the dignity of the people that we write about. That here they stand in their stature. I mean, these people are so beautiful. The one is in her garden, and she opens the book and she says, "Oh, I'm in my garden." I mean, how powerful and wonderful is that? And the woman who has been campaigning for the ANC was injured during the anti-apartheid struggle in a wheelchair. She sits in a wheelchair, all regal and glorious in her outfit, and she's sitting there and she wants to stand up for the photograph, looking proud. And so these are our ideas about what you do with the research. How do you restore? How do you restore people's dignity while you are working on the research? So here we are. This is what we did. We're very excited about this. Now, on Sunday, we launched the book. We were in Langa to launch the book. The hall was packed. Gobodo-Madikizela, those of you who know Langa, we are going to do the launch at all of these places, but the first was at Gobodo-Madikizela. And something struck us on Sunday when we were presenting this book. We are all excited. Mariki is here. She's one of the co-authors. We pride ourselves. We brought the book back, and Mariki and Friederike were the ones actually who traveled throughout of these areas to give people the book. And the stories that they tell about that moment are treasure for us to understand the importance of this. Now, what we realize is that if we take issues of reflexivity seriously, we've got then to answer this question: how are we implicated? How are we implicated in all of this? So even as we bring the research, how are we implicated? How am I implicated? What is my role as witness? Now, for me, this hit me more strongly because I grew up in Langa. And one of the people who told the story, whose story is told in the book, was my neighbor in Langa. He was blinded by someone who was called the Rambo of the Western Cape, who used to aim for people's eyes during anti-apartheid protests. And so he's blind. He was blinded in both eyes. Baba Skwepere was my neighbor. I know him from my childhood, and here he is. He's a storyteller, and here I am at Stellenbosch University, a professor. The question is, how are we implicated? There is a tendency that as black people often, we think we are exonerated from these questions because we are black. There, by the grace of God, we were born black, not white. And yet I think even, perhaps even especially for black people who are black, we ought to confront ourselves with these questions, to ask this question: what is my role as witness? That should be a question that is built into this whole process of reflexivity. What is my role as witness? And so we met and we found that this is not all. These are stories that we have to create the space. It's not enough to bring the book and say we've done it. How do we then tell the story so that we bring attention to the plight of these people? In fact, we realize that this is not just an empty observation. The children of these people, in one case, the child of a child, a grandchild, they were in the room and they were standing up and asking questions, confronting us with questions. And so the reality is, here we are, 3 generations And here I am with my story of having been in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s, 1970s, and 1980s. And here they are still in the struggles. And so, and it's not an anti-apartheid struggle, it's an anti-something else. But what is our role of witness is the key question. Issues of social justice, I think, require, the issues of research require our paying attention to issues of social justice. And I think, and I feel this very strongly, that the starting point for us, for our research, is to love first, is to care first. Care and love is to love first. If we love other people and we care for other people deeply enough, as people, as fellow human beings in our country, if you care for them and love them enough, then this is a building block for building solidarity with the other. And when we build solidarity with the other, we are able, therefore, to uphold these principles of social justice. We cannot always give something concretely, but in our actions, research has influenced the world very deeply. Research, if you go back even to the birth of concerns about ethics in research, they go back to the Holocaust and the consequences of the Holocaust, and the aftermath of that gave birth to ethics, the process of ethics. And so now there is a new birth of another era, and it calls us to respond with new kinds of engagement. And it seems to me that social justice at the heart of our research should be the driving force, particularly in social science research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think we have time for 3 or 4 questions. I want to thank you for a deeply personal, analytical exposition of this very complex issue. And I think certainly for me personally, it's allowed to reflect very deeply on this issue. As a physician, we subscribe to the Hippocratic Oath. One of the most important things of that is the first one, which is primum non nocere, which is at first do no harm. And I think if we hold to that, first do no harm in all these activities that we deal with, I think it'll be a good step forward and a very important step forward. I think it's also a testament, and I'm so proud to have you as a member of this university doing the fantastic work that you are doing, is we say we're a research-intensive university. What does it actually mean? And what do we actually want to do? So the other point that flows from that is we want to do research that is locally, I often say, locally relevant, regionally impactful, globally competitive, and illuminating, because we address complex societal issues. But I think what you've spoken to today, you can really glibly say that it is locally relevant in facing many of these and addressing many of these complex societal issues as well. But locally relevant is not an easy one, because the local issues are very, very tough for folks to address in terms of research, not only in my field, which is much more quantitative type of research, but in qualitative research that is very tough. And I think these are exactly the sorts of conversations that we are having, and we have unleashed, and that we've explored.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.